Hello, in this episode we're going to look at how to rack up your harness for lead climbing. Many ways of racking up your harness ready for lead climbing, and in the end it'll come down to personal preference. So we're going to go through a couple of tips about what to think about when you're racking up, and hopefully that'll help you as you're lead climbing. So first off, have a think about the things that you don't want until you're at the top of the climb, i.e. your belay device, your carabiners for setting up, perhaps your nut key, you might need that, but unlikely until the very end perhaps, and then any emergency equipment such as your prusik loops, for instance. So we'll get those items and then we'll put them right at the very back of the harness, because as you're lead climbing you're not going to be reaching round right to the very back to collect your gear, so tuck away the things that you don't want until the very end, right on the very back loops of your harness. So not only are you thinking about racking up your gear in terms of what's accessible and what you might need en route, also think about maybe perhaps the weight distribution across your harness. So trying to balance out your harness from left to right so that you've got fairly equal weights on either side. So the next thing would be a little bit of gear. So getting your nuts, getting your cams, hexies or torque nuts if you've got them, and getting them evenly distributed across your harness. So this is where a little bit of thought, a little bit of personal preference perhaps comes into play here. For instance, if I'm holding on and I want to get a piece of gear in very quickly, that's most likely to be a cam that I'm going to be putting in a hurry. Whereas a nut, for instance, you're going to find yourself a nice rest stance. You might take a little bit of time to get off of your harness and then place that bit of gear as well. So I tend to put my cams a little bit further forward on my harness than the nuts. Another thing I do that's perhaps a little bit different from some other people, Brett does it slightly differently, I put my smaller stuff on one side and my larger stuff on the other side, and that way I know where stuff is. I know another friend of mine does some big, some small on either side, and she's got something to fit every gear placement. So whatever you do, it's entirely up to you. Having some gear either side of your harness is quite helpful. But I do put the bigger cam very slightly towards the back, just because I'm little it tends to swing forward and take my knees out quite a lot, so I'll just put that on the back gear loop but at the front of the back gear loop so it's still accessible and within reach. Next up, your runners. A variety of runners is a very good thing, so you have the option of actually extending out your runners and making them a little bit longer to limit rope drag basically. So I generally carry at least one extendable runner, one alpine draw, and that sits again on the back loop towards the front, and then the rest of the runners will fall in behind the gear on the front loops there, so they're readily accessible. One thing I quite often see with people who are just starting out with lead climbing is that they'll forget to put the runners on the harness the correct way. Your runners have got two different snap gates to them, so one tends to move freely and the other is a bit more captured, and it's the captured one that's going to have the rope sitting in it eventually, and that one, the top one, is going to be for the gear. So it makes sense that when you put your hand on your harness to take your runner off, that your hand is automatically on the snap gate that's going to go straight into the gear. So rack up accordingly, so put gear carabiner at the top, clipped to your harness, so that it's ready to clip straight into the gear. Another thing to perhaps consider is whether you go gate in or gate out. And again, this is very much personal preference. So I prefer to go gate out, which means that all the gates face outwards away from my body. Some people prefer to go gate in. They often find it's easier to take off and clip stuff into the rock. Perhaps your runners, for instance, will be easier to get off. Your fingers are automatically on the gate, so it's ready to clip straight in. Gate out does mean that everything sits a little bit neater, and I have often found that clients with gate in, for instance, tend to drop nuts. They miss something that's just sitting in the corner there, and then as they go to unclip or clip, it unclips the nut. which is why I've sort of preferred gate out for me, but personal preference. Final things, last but by no means least, are your slings. Several different ways you can carry these. Some people prefer to sort of have them tied up on their little snap gate and then clip them straight onto your harness. So a couple of ways you can do that. Obviously you don't want it sort of trailing along the floor or catching in your feet, so get the sling, do a twist, fold it in half, so you have double stranded all the way around. Some people like to twist it and then clip the ends together so it sits nicely. Other people might prefer to put one big overhand, a very gentle overhand, in the middle of the sling, and then clip the two ends together. So with the twist method, it is easier and quicker to undo the sling and shake it all out so it's ready to go. So that might be if you're mid-route, you might want the sling. Overhand knot, it's very quick, slightly quicker to do perhaps than the twist, but it does take up a little bit more space on the harness. It doesn't get twisted or tangled as much as the twisted method. One final way, which is perhaps my preferred method, is to take the sling over the back, across one shoulder and underneath the other arm, and then with your carabiner just clip the two ends together. And that means if you've got one hand on the rock, you can take the sling off and it's ready for use to clip into your gear or thread onto a thread round a chalk stone or something. Depends how likely you are to use your slings, whether you want to use them en route or whether you're more likely to use them at the very top for your setups. Might determine how you carry your slings. And just remember, everything is personal preference, whether you've got your gear on one side, whether you've got an even distribution, whether you've got large or small on either side or a mixture of both, it's entirely up to you. The key thing to remember is make sure that you remember where your stuff is on your harness, because that's going to be very crucial when you're hanging on and trying to get your gear off in a hurry. Knowing where everything is and having that inbuilt memory is going to save you those few extra seconds of hanging on when you're lead climbing on. I hope you found this video useful. If you're in any doubt, please do seek the help of a professional and a guide or a climbing instructor. We do other tutorials and videos, so please do check them out on our channel as well. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye!